Coming up on Arirang News, President Moon Jae-in says he expects South Korea can see positive growth in its economy this quarter thanks to his administration's policies and a recovery in exports. China has agreed to let its South Korean residents come back to the country, issuing them visas from next month. Relief for those who need to go to work or school in China. And tensions between China and the U.S. continue to rise. Beijing has closed an American consulate in the city of Chengdu in response to Washington's shutdown of a Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. China has officially closed the U.S. consulate in Chengdu in response to the Trump administration's order shutting down the Chinese consulate in Houston last week. Lee Kyung-eun has the latest.
The U.S. consulate in Chengdu officially shut its doors on Monday. Beijing had ordered the closure on Friday after Washington instructed China's consulate in Houston, Texas, to cease all operations citing espionage allegations. Beijing set the deadline at 10 a.m., giving the U.S. Embassy the same 72-hour time frame that the Chinese embassy had been given in Houston last week. As the deadline expired, the Chinese Foreign Ministry announced the closure on social media platform Weibo at around 11 a.m., saying relevant Chinese authorities then entered from the main entrance and took over. AP reported that the U.S. State Department confirmed the closure. Ahead of the deadline, the American flag was lowered early on Monday morning. And over the weekend, the U.S. insignia was taken down and cargo trucks were loaded with shipping containers. Local residents gathered at the site, showing mixed responses.
I approve. The U.S. closed our consulate. I think we should shut theirs too.
China and the U.S. should handle their relations through negotiation and international forums, so there won't be more conflicts.
The Chengdu mission holds great significance to the United States as it covers diplomatically sensitive areas like Xinjiang and Tibet. It is seen as a T-410 move against the Houston closure, as that's the first Chinese consulate built in the U.S. after two countries normalized their relations in 1979. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
South Korea reported 25 new cases of COVID-19 on Monday, the first time in a week it's had fewer than 30. Of those, 9 were transmitted locally and 16 were imported. 9 were reported in Seoul and 6 in Gyeonggi-do province. The total cases now stand at 14,175. There was one additional death, raising the death toll to 299. The South Korean government has decided to tighten its controls on people entering the country through seaports. The number of coronavirus cases found among sailors on foreign ships has been rising. Lee Seung-jae reports.
With strict quarantine measures and guidelines in place, the number of local COVID-19 transmissions has been on a steady decline. The big concern now are the high number of imported cases. Over the past 2 weeks, the nation has been averaging over 31 imported cases a day, 12 more than the previous 2-week average. As a result, the government will now require all sailors on foreign ships to submit a document indicating negative tests within 48 hours of departure and test negative again before they are allowed to dock.
We plan to minimize the number of ships coming in by conducting strict inspections on the crew and only approving the ships if they all tested negative.
The high number of imported cases has also put a strain on the cost of treatment. On Sunday, Prime Minister Chung Se-kyun said South Korea will push to revise the law to require foreign COVID-19 patients to cover the costs of their treatment. He said the increasing number of foreign patients among the imported cases could strain the nation's medical system. He added the country will either make foreign patients pay all or part of the cost for their hospitalization, but under the principle of reciprocity considering diplomatic relations. As it stands, in-hospital and treatment expenses for confirmed patients are covered by the government, regardless of nationality. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Today, July 27th, is the day South Korea remembers the efforts of UN forces to defend the country in the Korean War. It also marks the 67th anniversary of the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement in 1953. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
South Korea celebrates the UN Forces Participation Day every year on July 27th. The day marks the anniversary of the signing of the Korean War Armistice Agreement in Panmunjom in 1953. The day is set aside to express the country's appreciation for the sacrifice and contributions of some 2 million Korean War veterans from 22 countries that fought alongside South Korean forces under the UN flag. At this year's ceremony, descendants of the veterans currently studying in South Korea will attend the event on behalf of their grandparents who are unable to make it due to the coronavirus outbreak. Also this year, the names of the veterans who died will be roll called. The agreement brought an end to more than 3 years of brutal fighting in which the Allied forces fought to defeat the expansion of communism on the Korean peninsula. To this day, the two Koreas are still divided along the 38th parallel. Once decimated in the aftermath of the Korean War, South Korea has now developed into one of the world's most vibrant, dynamic, and economically prosperous democracies thanks to the veterans. South Korea has forged strong alliances with the countries that came to South Korea's aid in its time of need. There is also an understanding that the alliance with the UN is vital to peace and stability on the peninsula and in Northeast Asia. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in expressed hope today that South Korea's economy will see positive economic growth in the third quarter of this year through efforts by both the public and private sectors. In a meeting with his top aides, he said despite the contraction in the second quarter, the country fared better than other OECD member states and is on the course to recovery.
정부는 3분기를 반드시 경기 반등을 놓칠 수 없는 기회로 보고 비상한 각오로 가용한 정책 수단을 총동원하겠습니다. 국민들께서도 정부를 믿고 경제 반등의 성공을 위해 힘을 모아주시기 바랍니다.
The South Korean economy shrank 2.9% on year in the April to June period of this year. Moon said a rebound is expected thanks to increased domestic spending spurred by the government's emergency relief funds, a recovery in domestic travel, and a pickup in exports. Moon added that the Korean New Deal will also be able to support the economy through job creation and expanded investment. The president also called for caution against the heavy rains during the monsoon season, asking officials to thoroughly prepare for potential landslides and flooding and to step up response measures. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, good to have you back on.
Happy to be here.
Stocks on Wall Street ended lower last Friday, in part because of these renewed tensions with China. This week, though, we'll be getting the growth figures for the U.S. economy in the second quarter. What's the story in the global markets and your outlook?
Okay, well, the stock futures seems slightly up, so it might be an optimistic week. On Friday, the U.S. companies are also having their earning report season, and about 128 of S&P 500 companies reported earnings, and while they have reported that their earnings have fallen 40% from a year earlier, also 81% beat analyst expectations. So things are bad, but not as bad as analysts expected. And it's not as bad as fourth quarter of 2008 when earnings went down by about 69%. So far, earnings seems to be down about 40%. So that might be feeding some optimism into the stock market in the United States. There's also some hopes that U.S. government will extend their fiscal stimulus and unemployment benefits. They're due to run out at the end of July, but the Congress is finally trying to extend those acts, and there are rumors that there might be another $1,200 payment to households. So that is feeding into the optimism as well. And if you look at the unemployment reports for the May, June, and April, the unemployment figures were not as bad as economists suspected. So the second quarter GDP may be better than analyst expectations, though third quarter may be worse than analyst expectations because the lockdown is returning. But still, these factors may feed into the U.S. stock market, and it might be a slightly optimistic week this week. So Dow and S&P, they've continued falling from Wednesday to Friday. NASDAQ has fallen all last week, but this week they might be going up slightly. On Europe, even though the Eurozone finalized what may be an historic plan aiding all members of the Eurozone, the market had a very bad week last week. Both FTSE and Euro 50 fell since Tuesday. Asia, China, most Asian stocks fell on Friday because China-U.S. Trade friction, the closing of the consulate in the United States and China. But today, Chinese stock market, the Shanghai market, seems to be doing slightly better because, well, their reports of industrial profits for June seem to have risen by 11.5% year on year. But the Hang Seng index fell slightly today, and the Nikkei fell slightly also.
Now, Korean stocks were significantly higher today. Tell us about that and what was driving the trade here in Seoul.
Okay, well, for Korea, the individual investors sold today while the institutions and foreigners bought stocks. Now, Korea is also beginning its second quarter reporting season. It'll last until August 15th. Most Korean firms tend to report toward the end of the legally required period, so we'll see a lot more at the beginning of August rather than right now. But still, about 30 firms have reported so far, and about 2/3 have reported fallen earnings from last year's second quarter. That was expected, but also about 2/3 of them reported that their losses are not as bad as expected, like the United States. So that might be feeding some of the optimism as well. Kospi has been rising somewhat unsteadily, but still rising for the last month. It gained 0.79% today. It almost, but not quite, erased the losses that were made on last Thursday and Friday. Kosdaq had a smoother upward trend last month. It rose 0.81%, and that erased what loss they had on Friday.
Well, we're almost out of time, Professor, but coming up in the week ahead, what's on your radar?
Okay, well, domestically, there's a consumer and business sentiment index, but what's catching most people's attention is government plans to what to do about Seoul area housing. They're supposed to report how they're going to increase the supply of housing in the Seoul area, so that's going to take most of the attention. On foreign statistics, the U.S. FOMC is having a meeting this week, but because U.S. interest rate is already at 0%, interest rate is not much of a mystery. It can't fall any further unless U.S. decides to go minus, and that's not going to happen. But what alternate monetary policy they're thinking of, that's going to catch a lot of attention.
Got it. All right, Professor Young, thanks so much for coming on today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
South Koreans who have not been able to return to school or work in China because of the pandemic will be able to go back from next month. Speaking in Beijing on Monday, South Korean Ambassador Jang Ha-sung said China has agreed to issue 3 types of visas for Korean students, workers, and residents who have a valid resident certificate. Visa issuance is reportedly set to resume in early August. Jang noted that Seoul and Beijing will still need to work on visas for South Koreans whose resident certificates are expired. China has banned the entry of foreigners, including those with residence visas, since the end of March. South Koreans are apparently putting more money than ever into their savings accounts, despite the government's efforts to boost consumption during the pandemic. The Bank of Korea says deposits in the first half of the year total almost $92 billion. That's more than double the figure a year earlier and the biggest increase on record. The BOK says households have borrowed more money to get through tough times, but they're holding on and waiting for the right time to spend it. Experts say this shows the government's policies to boost the economy are not having a big enough impact. Germany has rejected a proposal from U.S. President Donald Trump to invite Russia back into the G7. President Trump had floated the idea last month. Russia was kicked out of the G7 in 2014 for its annexation of Crimea and its intervention in eastern Ukraine. German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas says he sees no chance of Russia joining the group again as long as it offers no solution to the problem. As for Trump's proposal of expanding the G7 to include countries such as Australia, India, and South Korea, Heiko Maas said there's no need for more members, and the G7 and G20 are two sensibly organized formats. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.